We go.
All right, Guy, how are you doing today? You doing all right?
Doing great. So you were
Outstanding,
talking about how
outstanding.
you got into philosophy, and actually there's something you talked about that right away that's really interesting to me, right? Which is, it sounds like you made a pretty conscious choice, or were clear, at least when you said it, you were clear about, like, for you to do your work, right? Like basically you wanted to make your money in a way that didn't use your mind all that much, right? So that you
Yes,
can like totally do the work that you wanted to do.
yes,
That's
yes, yes.
I mean, that's an impressive choice.
Oh, well, every now and then we make, we get lucky, I suppose. I guess when you grow up on a farm, it's like right there where you can do blue collar work and different things. And this is why I retrospect, and I have a lifelong plan the entire time, and I wasn't improvising as I go. No. It was all a long stream plan and different things like that. But no, in all seriousness, I always had wanted to do my work. I guess I had started doing different writings and things in middle school and different things and different readings, and had decided that I wanted to do more like wholesale unloading trucks, farm, blue collar, different things, that you had the mind to do the work that I wanted to do. Because I do think sometimes, if you spend the day unloading a truck, right? Well, then when you come home and you're not mentally exhausted, where you're still able to do what you would like to do. So I always felt like that was a way that you could do both. And again, Guy, I have to apologize that I don't have the giant inflatable golden bridge that I wanted to get from the Amazon Lightning deal, so that you felt at home in Virginia. Like I said, I maxed out one credit card, paid it with another credit card, paid that with another, and for some reason that was a problem. I'm really sorry about that, Guy. Oh my gosh. Just missed that lightning deal. It was so close.
Totally. I don't know what's worse, like missing that or the bunny suit.
I know. I told you I was going to have the Christmas toy bunny shoot, and my daughter took it before the meeting. She thought it was so cute. And I said, I have a very serious meeting and I have to have a good impression. And it's going to be very difficult without a bunny suit. But children, they have their vision. They're going to stick to it. So, but no, I just found it really important to sort of have that separation between work and mind, which that was just for me. And also, before I forget, Guy, last time we talked, we mentioned something about Heidegger, and you were talking about Heidegger, like a groundlessness of being. And I mentioned kind of Tolstoy in the biography where he's floating over the void, and how, like, in Heidegger's, and I've been thinking about that. I think it's a little dark. I almost now want to say I've been thinking about Heidegger and magic tricks, and it's almost like, when you see a really good magic trick.
Heidegger and what?
Magic tricks. Heidegger and magic tricks. Right. And it's like when you see a really good magic trick, and you have this moment where there's a second where you like really believe there's magic, and then your brain comes in and says, "No, it must have been a trick." It's almost like Heidegger is like, just stop, just spend a minute. Look at the world. Look at being. Okay, don't try to give it a ground. Just take in some awe. Can we, for a moment there, believe in some sort of magic? So instead of like this dark image of Tolstoy floating over a void, more like a body is floating in air, and it's like amazing. It's like, wow, look at that. There's this thing floating. And so being doesn't have this ground, but it's like floating. And it's also where I think he wants to argue that the nature of thought has to conclude that groundlessness is a trick because of how it structures reality. So he wants us to be aware that the very fact that we perceive that there must be some sort of quote unquote trick to the magic may be the case, but that's also the conclusion that our thinking must necessarily structure toward us. And thus, I think he wants to talk about new kinds of thinking. So I was thinking about that metaphor, and I think metaphors matter because, Susan Sontag always talks about metaphors magic. Also, I think metaphors are really important in philosophy because metaphors are a way to kind of mix thinking with what you perceive. Where like good thinking is always trying to be ground in the world. And like when you find a good image, it's almost like a space where thinking and perceiving mix, where sometimes in philosophical language, you can have a lot of abstract language, kind of, which is important. I mean, Dasein, these matter, but I think it's good to get the metaphors. I was thinking a lot about that metaphor based on Heidegger, and I'm sure Johannes somewhere was throwing up, and he took his laptop and threw it out a window because it wasn't, very good. But I was thinking about this idea of letting there be that moment where you have the magic occur and not trying to rush in and solve it, to just let it present itself as really having that wonder of awe. So I think that might be better than using Tolstoy.
Right. Well, it's interesting because it's like with Heidegger, what many people consider him the hardest philosopher to understand. But it's interesting when you look at actually what he's attempting to think or understand. Its difficulty is in its nearness. Where he's looking, it's so And I think that's what you're pointing to, is in some sense, he's essentially, I mean, he was, for the most part, he was still born like, the little town that he in the what was it, the Black Forest, right? He essentially was born in 1750, right?
Right.
So he had, in some sense, I think my understanding is like, he saw modernity, right? Not gradually come, but just come into a place where there was not modernity, right? To there being modernity. So I think he had a view, right? That was a little bit more kind of instant than just dwelling in it, right? And growing up in it. And so I think that I always got a sense that him living in the Heidegger hut, right, and pumping his water and doing all of that kind of stuff, right, was in some sense, that's actually what he was interested in, I think, on a personal level, right? He didn't want to go any further than that, right?
Oh yeah, sometimes I think I always, my grandmother, she lived to be about 94, and she grew up when they didn't even have electricity. And I do think sometimes our generation really does forget how radical technology changed. We think it changed because we've gotten the internet, but if we really think about it, technology, I think when they talk, Tyler Cohn and them and the economists talk about stagnation, where there's been a lot of innovation in terms of bits, but not so much in terms of atoms. That's something like Peter Thiel and them talk about. So a lot of our innovation has been just faster internet, but they literally went from horse and buggies to cars to airplanes. Like, they had a very radical technological shift that occurred that I think we similarly experience, and we certainly do in regard to information technology, but not also in terms of transportation and things like that. So I think that's important to realize that Heidegger is in fact writing in those terms. And also he's existing, I guess, when he was born. I mean, modern war as we know it, total war, totalizing war, these things are also being introduced that transforms his thinking. The other thing that I think what you're saying on abstraction that I really like, if you get in an airplane and you go really high into the sky and you look down, it actually, like, especially if you go over, like, when I went to teach English in China, like 7 or so years ago, we went over, I guess, the North Pole, because you go over and you come to the other side. When you're looking down at the North Pole, it's like an abstract painting, all these different lines. And it looks so much like an abstract painting, and yet it's incredibly concrete. Like, that's a concrete reality down there. And likewise, if I go out to my wood porch, I have a porch, if you get down on the ground and look at the lines in the wood, it's like an abstract painting, right? And yet a wood porch is incredibly concrete. There's nothing abstract about a wood porch, but it's because of the nearness. It suddenly becomes like an abstract painting. So when you get super close, it becomes abstract. And when you're super far away, it becomes really, really abstract. And so I think what you see in Heidegger is he likes to do kind of these philosophical gymnastics where he gets really close and then he might fly up. Like, there's not much of a middle. I'm gonna speak generally. I'm not an expert on Heidegger. There's not much of a middle. It's either super, super close or super, super far. Super, super close and super, super far. And yet it's always, the beauty of Heidegger is the subject material is actually not abstract. It's the nearness or farness from the subject that creates the abstraction. He's always this very down-to-earth people. Like, what? He's like the first philosopher who talks about moods. Like, how many philosophers talked about moods, for goodness sakes? He's talking about hammers, by using. His subjects are always very concrete, but he's getting very close to them or very far from them. That creates a feeling of abstraction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And it makes a lot of sense. And I think that have you seen the video, any of the videos of Ivo De Janeiro?
Maybe this is the part where I admit that I haven't seen all the things on YouTube that I'm supposed to be an educated person. So I lost the glass bead. Gosh darn it, I lost the glass bead. So anyway,
he's the Italian. He's Johannes's professor in college.
Oh, they're in my watch list. I knew that name. Okay. He's in my watch list, but I haven't watched it because I'm a terrible human being and it failed. I have failed miserably at being informed.
Right. This is one you would definitely want to watch, right? Because he picks up that aspect of Heidegger, and I think he's deepening it, right? and there's this way in which, and I think this kind of goes back to the first conversation that we had, where we talked about Helen Keller, right? That there's this way that we live in language, right? That in some sense, language, strangely enough, is the, on one level, it's almost pure abstraction on one level, but but on another level, it is what we live inside of, is language, right? So Helen Keller is, deaf, dumb, and blind. Like the teacher puts her hand in water over and over again, probably 1,000 times, and then puts the symbol water. And she said one day she got water. And in that moment, she said she got the world, right? She said before that moment of getting one name, right? There was no her, there was no time, there was no space, there was just unfolding pleasure and pain without continuity. And then she said when she got language, she got the world, right? She got her, she got water, she got up, down, and it went boom, 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 boom. And I think there's something about that I think that Heidegger and a lot of the continental philosophers are circling around, right? Which is so interesting, right? It's so primordial, this kind of way that we sound out being, right? Because there's so many things that we live inside of that aren't actually concrete at all. Like, love, right? You don't see that, right? Like corporations, like all of these kinds of things only have being as disclosed by language, right? And so there's this way that I think Heidegger really kind of circled around and really like looked at language in its primordiality, right? And that's the thing that I think that we dwell in, right?
Oh yeah, well, one, Heidegger is also, since anything I say on Heidegger, I can't be authoritative because I don't know the German. So so I'm automatically disqualified. So I'm just, speaking from the English translation, which is probably totally wrong. But as I understand it, Heidegger is really trying to avoid the language of subject. He's always in his talks just kind of almost like actions are happening, like things are happening, this kind of always already is kind of how the language is structured. There's also a poetry to the language because there's I think a way to kind of explain, if I say to you the word cat, okay, so something comes into your head, I say cat, but then I say brown fuzzy with a white spot on its chest. Then the image goes a little more. And then I say heartbeat in the rib cage and it purrs at midday. Okay, there's a little more. And I say, tends to greet me when I first wake up in the morning because it knows I get there at 7:30. I keep adding and this kind of fuller picture starts coming. And yet all of it was contained in the word cat, right? And yet it wasn't. Yet it wasn't at all. But when I say the word cat, I kind of know what I'm saying, but then I have to kind of add to it, and I sort of add to it. Well, what if I say being? What if I say the world, right? And also if I'm trying to get at the very structures of intelligibility by which I approach the world. How do I add descriptions to those structures that make them not part of the structures in a manner that captures them in the already preset understanding that has locked me into a way of thinking of, dare I say, capital B being, I know that's not technically correct, with lowercase beings, right? How do I escape that? So he's finding a way to describe, in the same way that I was describing more details about a cat to get a fuller image so you can feel it and then maybe you can smell it. So how do I describe being to you in such a way with new language so you're not still captured by your preset language? And it can strike us as very strange, but it's similar. When you have, some of the great lines out of poetry or King Lear, or, when you talk about, time present and time past is all concealed in time present, or the infinite question rolled up into a ball, let us go then you and I off the path that doesn't stray back to love the moves and star to star, combining Eliot. There are these sort of lines where when you get the right poetic lines, it sort of unlocks an understanding. You're like, oh, that's what love is. Or Joyce, it's like love loves to love. You're like, oh, that's kind of right. There's something about love that seeks itself. You hear these certain lines as they unlock. And we know that from art and poetry. And there's a bit of where Heidegger seems to want to bring that into ontology. And I think also alludes to why he gets interested in poetry and art as he goes along. But there's something about language that we need in order to get the world. But here's kind of the problem. The mechanism by which we get the world also conceals the world. And so we constantly have to deconstruct and sort of dig up that language in order to get to something behind it. But here's the thing, if we didn't have the language, we couldn't know there was a thing that was worth trying to get behind. So it's like a journey. You have to know language to know language, but then behind language, which sounds similar to the start. It sounds like you're just going back to a pre-language state, but it's different. It's almost like Eliot at the end where, you know, four quartets where you say, to return to the place of our beginnings, to know it for the first time. You have to return to the place of your beginnings to know it for the first time. And there's like this movement through language that you have to go on to get home. That's what's it. I'm glad you, Brent, you know, when you're talking about Heidegger and the forest, right? Where you're talking, there's a very real sense in which his entire philosophy is a kind of returning home. But it's anew. And I've always liked that because I see David Hume and I love the Scots. So there's like this returning home and making home new. It's almost like when you're born, you know, home feels like home. But then when you get older, it starts to feel like a house. And the question is, how can we make it feel like a home again? How can we restore that wonder? So home, maybe a lowercase h home, then turns into a house. And then we want to make it a home, capital H home. There's some sort of movement there where there's a return, but it's some kind of making new in that return.
Well, that's the kind of thing where this word dwelling is really interesting. This kind of thing where he talks a lot about to dwell, right? Which is a very distinctive thing, right? It's got this quality of like to dwell, because it also kind of we can come home by virtue of being homeless, right? And in some sense, there is this, right? That's what affords us to be able to dwell, right, on the earth as we kind of haunt it with otherness, right? And that's right. And to dwell, and it is precisely in our homelessness that home becomes possible.
Yes. Oh, that's exactly right. You can't technically be homeless if you don't have a home. Like if you're just born in a void and there was nothing there, you couldn't be homeless. Now, the interesting thing is the idea of the psychoanalytic, you know, that Cadell was talking about, on the idea that we are essentially born constituted by a lack, feeling like something is missing that never actually existed, and yet we nevertheless experience as a loss. He was talking about that in regard to I guess Zizek's friend, What is Sex book. That was really interesting. And then, of course, like Christian thinkers like C.S. Lewis will say that very feeling of a loss is evidence that you're created by a God you want to return to. But then for like the psychoanalysis, it's a Freudian return to a primordial unity that you never actually had, but you still feel like you lost. And then in Heidegger, but there's a sense of a return home. So there is a question I always wonder about in Heidegger with this sort of returning to a home. How much is that similar to the psychoanalysis thinking of a loss? Is that all being ultimately is at the end of the day? But what are we doing there? That's where we're taking the magic and we're turning it into a magic trick. You know, he's like, well, can we keep it in the magic instead of just saying it's some sort of trick? Maybe it is at the end of the day, but that's what's kind of interesting to me. Is it like, it doesn't seem like an escapism to give it a feeling of maybe there's some awe and magic here. And then it's almost like you can't even verify and know for certain if it's a loss that you can never recover. So there's some interesting exercise. I was writing on that today, trying to kind of think through that, because I've been thinking about that Heidegger metaphor with Tolstoy and kind of not feeling good with that. But there's something there where I kind of overlay Heidegger with some of the psychoanalysis thinkers.
Well, just right there. So what is that? So what is that you're doing when you're writing about that? Like, what is that? Are you? It's a strange question, I guess, kind of.
No, it's a great question.
Right. Well, what is it are you responding to something? Like, is there something happening in you, or is there something happening in the world? Like, what is it that has you do something crazy like that? Right. Working out.
Coffee. Coffee will do it. But if you're looking for a deeper metaphysical answer, I think it's quite funny. I think a lot of times one writes or thinks in order to translate something they know into something they understand. Like you have an intuition, oh, there's something important there, and you're writing in order to sort of articulate, to kind of, it's like you're walking around the outline of a crater and you're like, I think there was a meteor here, but let me walk around to get a sense of it. So there's this, you know, it's kind of tied to, I guess, classically, there's a lot of thinking of knowing as remembering. You see that in Augustine, Plato, and different things. And there's something where it's like, you know, that there's something important that that Lacan and Heidegger, this sort of loss that we expect. There's some C.S. Lewis, they're all kind of talking about the similar thing. And and I think what's also really important for philosophical work, I find it's important, is to assume that all of them are right. And I know that's kind of crazy, but what you do is they can't all be right. But if you assume they're all right, then you have to think deeply. Like the moment you just say, oh, well, Lacan's crazy. Well, I don't have to think about him anymore. Oh, C.S. Lewis, he's not. But if you actually assume the best, assume that they all are getting at something, that creates a dialectical process in your writing where I think you get to deeper thought. So just as a tip, I think that's important. So I think you're trying to, so what do you do when you write? I think you're trying to articulate a sense that there's something important here. I also think, into something you understand, I also think philosophy entails very real stakes. And what I mean by that, for example, if it is indeed the case that the human being is thrown, per se, into a always already sense of something important being lost, then if you believe that that thing lost is something you can get back, then that's going to have a practical impact on your life. As opposed to if you think it's something that you can never get back in this life, but maybe you can get back in the afterlife if you're religious, or maybe you think it's something you lost, but it never existed in the first place. Well, relative to which of those macro views you have of this capital X variable that is not present, that will dramatically transform your life. And so deciding which of those possibilities is most plausible, maintains the most internal consistency in the system, which one you can actually live, that's a really big deal. The other thing that always interests me too is if the question of the nature of the capital B being or capital N nothing, you know, we always capitalize a word and then it's super cool. Like there's a temptation to capitalize, but let's just, you know, the X variable, whatever the X is, you know, in algebra. There's also, I always like thinking about Thomas Pynchon and the crying of Lot 49, which is kind of this idea that there's this global conspiracy and like the world's being controlled by the mail office. But as you explore it, like you just go deeper and you can never find evidence that it's there, but you go on forever. And it's kind of like an abyss that as you go deeper, you can keep going deeper. So there's also this question of how much is the exploration of the X variable kind of sinking into an abyss, like in that show Made for Abyss, or is it like a Pritchard risk? But actually you have to, so maybe it's that, but you have to figure out that. But then the other thing is you just practically examine when people give up on the X variable or they don't think about it at all, they end up still living out some sort of assumption about the X variable, which can be very negative or very nihilistic, or they can lose wonder. They may not have wonder. They might not have all. The question of being may not matter to them. So for me, one of the reasons, so wanting to get a grasp on which of those possibilities of the X variable, the capital B being, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you want to go with is going to really impact your life. Also, you were asking me about why I do blue collar work and different things like that. If you decide that the X variable is found most in the embedding in a common life, like a real life where you live and you use your hands to do things, like there's something about using the world. If you conclude that that is necessary somehow for contact with the X variable, well, then you're going to be like, oh, well, I'm going to go unload trucks and I'm going to have a garden and I'm going to actually like commit to an actual life because you've decided from your writing that that is a necessary precondition for an encounter with that capital X variable, whatever it may be. And maybe it's a mixture of those three macro possibilities where the only way to get at the X variable is in accepting lack, accepting a permanent state of non-fullness, but also seeking in that lack, like I was talking with Cadell and Alex and Tim on the philosophy of lack, on learning how to accept those inescapable incompleteness is also a precondition for a life of beauty, for a life of the sublime, for a life of the condition, so that you find in the commitment to an actual life. So I think that's why you want to do it, is to get a sense of, you know, mapping out the terrain. You know, the map can never be the territory, right? The map can never be the territory. But man, if I'm dealing with like, you know, the territory of reality, I'd like to probably have a pretty good map, but that means I have to make a map because there's, or you read, you know, you're reading Aristotle, you're reading Heidegger to find a map, and you find that the map needs to be a mixture of all these thinkers. Precisely also too, because technology is always changing. Aristotle's not writing during the internet. So, you always have to kind of bring them to the horizon of your present. And also, Heidegger and Aristotle and Plato and all these people are thinking different things that when you put together can all, one of them's got the compass, one of them's got the hook shot, one of them's got the light arrow. A very good listener will note I'm making a Zelda metaphor. You've got these different tools that you can use that then you can beat the water temple, because that was really hard in Ocarina of Time. So you need all those different thinkers to do that. So I think that, to answer your question, that would be part of the impulse, the wonder and wanting to get my relation to that X variable correct.
Right.
I mean, you can never know with certainty, but you want to make a good shot at it, right?
Well, there's also that thing you brought up, a really good, I think a really astute point is, on one level, even if you don't consciously think about this, your non-understanding is an understanding in which kind of runs your life on some level, right? How you understand, because it just makes sense. It's like you're like, given that everything partakes of being, right? How you understand being, right, is going to matter to everything, right?
Absolutely.
Every response to everything. So, and there is a way, and so on some level, it's a strange thing because so it's because this is one of the things I've been asking myself, because I don't know, honestly, I don't know why I go to the bookstore and buy $2,000 worth of books, right? The other day, I don't really know why.
Because it was Prime Day, Greg. It was it was Guy. It was Prime Day. My brother's Greg. I said Greg. Wow, sorry. It was Prime Day. That's why you didn't spend $2,000, because Jeff Bezos loves you and he cares. He wants you to be informed. That's why.
Right, totally. So there's this kind of, there seems to be something indigenous about this X factor, right? Of that we find ourselves oriented towards it. And in some way, it's like almost like a condition. It's not like we're over here and then there's an X thing that we can think about over there. It just seems like there's something about that we is already in relationship to this X, right? And that thinking, and what I'm hearing in the way that you're talking about it is, and my sense about the way the Greeks talked about thinking, when they talked about thinking, I think what they meant was more perceiving, right? I think
it's much closer. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because that's always rung more true to me, because it's like it's like when you're thinking, you're looking into something, you're listening to something. It's like you kind of find out what you think, but it's usually in some tension, some unresolved, something you can't quite put your finger on, right? That that in some way we show up, we're already in response to it, right? It's not like we get into response to it. It's like we're already in response to it, right? Even not responding is a response to it. So it's this kind of thing that's so near and indigenous to us.
Oh yeah, well, you said it really well. When you look into, I mean, that's what you're thinking, right? You're looking into. There's a thing there that you're trying to look into to see a depth, but also look into in the sense of to see it on the surface. Because what are you looking at? Maybe if you go back to the example, we go back to the wood porch. You're looking into it. You're looking into it. You're getting closer. There's different abstract levels, but you're looking into a thing. Well, I sometimes wonder. If digital technology, like the ability to talk to you on a screen, then kind of makes me think that the nature of reality is primarily disembodied. And I wonder if screens and maybe the book, it would be interesting to link, once you created a book, I read a really interesting book called The Invention of News. And it was talking about how and I guess, well, this is all Derrida, I guess, and grammatology, on the idea that once you have the book, it's possible to hear words when there's not a person there. And therefore, the whole idea of abstraction really is kind of birthed by the printing press. And I wonder sometimes if that has really gotten worse with the internet and different things, that kind of feeling of thinking. But and basically the book made a really interesting point, The Invention of News, where it said it used to be that people didn't trust something that they didn't hear from someone face to face. Like, how can you trust someone if you're not talking to the person directly? But today it's just the opposite. It's like, oh, well, they're subjective. You need authority. When it's printed, then it has authority, right? Yeah. And it's funny how there's been that sort of shift where now it's almost like the more abstract it is, the more authority it has. Right. And yet there's something about abstraction has the least to do with reality. And there also is a sense, I've been wondering about this, and I wouldn't take a hard stand on it, but I was thinking about this yesterday. If you think about it, it's really hard to have an idea that is like a pure abstraction. Like right now, let me think about Grace dressed in the bunny costume. Okay, well, there's color, there's shape, there's ears, there's a person, there's biology, there's a background. Like thought itself, when you pay attention to thought is always trying to be about the world. Like think of even a unicorn. Like think about a unicorn. What's a unicorn? It's a horse with a horn. Well, you've experienced horns, you've experienced horses. So thought in its very experience is screaming at you that we want to be about perceived things. We want to be in a dance of things you perceive. Just try to think of a thought that's about, there's no such thing as pure thought. There's no such thing as pure thought. Have you ever had a thought that literally has no geometrical, mathematical, I don't know, physical relation to the world? It's like impossible, right? So it's really weird because thought itself says to you that there's no pure thought, that it's a dance between what's in your head and what you perceive. And yet we have this category that's kind of weird that I guess is birthed to us by our information technology of idea that is pure idea. And I sometimes think that gets read back onto Plato. I think his understanding of form is different from Aristotle. I'm not an expert on it, but I don't think it's this heaven. I think there's some Christendom going on in Plato that's a mistake, but I'm not an expert on it. But it seems to me that we have a category for thought that doesn't even exist. That if we actually even paid attention to thinking itself, it's saying to us that thinking must be about perceived and that it needs to be closer to perceived, because you can't even have a thought that is composed of ingredients that aren't perceived. Does that make sense? Because I was just thinking about that yesterday.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's like you can't, it's indigenous to some kind of just being embedded in the earth. It's like in some sense. I think this is, there was, I'm reading something on, I think it's The Time of Life. It's what it's called. It's like a study of Aristotle and Heidegger's, right, notion of ethos, right, as life, right? And he's basically kind of pointing out one of the things that an ambiguity that has played itself out, right, in Heidegger's estimation since, right, which is, and I think this is what the ambiguity was, is that in some places Aristotle talked about theoria, right, as a praxis, right, and then there's other places where he mostly, and this is where I think it's mostly understood, is that no, like theory is something separate from that. It's more like a techne, right? A making that stands outside of praxis, right? And there's this ambiguity because he talks about them and he never quite distinguishes them very, very clearly. And I think this is kind of what we're getting at, is that it's impossible, because thought is in some sense, it's always bound up with care, right?
Yes, that's
it's
right.
Not,
that's
it's all
exactly.
care. I mean, if it's made of anything, it's made of care, and that care is the way that it's the structure of our world, of that we're here and there's something over there that I'm responsible for, and it concerns me, and it has time, and everything kind of unfolds. So thought is like this turning of that care, right, in some sense.
Absolutely.
And so it's really, in some sense, thought is not, it seems grounded not in theory at all, but theory is a way of attuning to your world in some sense, right?
It would be very curious to understand where the emphasis on philosophical theory or systemizing came from, why that's become like a gold standard, because I don't even really see it in Hegel. Like, I guess Cadell got me going back to Hegel, and like, Hegel is really associated with this great systematizer, and I'm going back and I'm like, I don't know. He's really talking about like paying attention to the mind and the operations and absolute. Hegel, there's something really crazy going on in it. Like, well, Cadell, it's amazing. So anyway, even Plato, like Plato was accused of a system, and I guess the Republic has a systemizing element to it. But so much of Plato is even just dialogues. It's more like, well, in the new metaphysics that with the philosophy of Glimmer that I do with Rivera and Jockin, I really think like so much of great philosophy is about the act of apprehension itself, like the wonder of apprehension, like the very fact that you look at a cat. I love making examples of cats, and you look at a cat and say, that is a cat. You know, all the stuff about how do you know if it's the perfect cat, or how do you know it's really a cat, or how are you certain that it's not really a lion? All of that is kind of secondary. Philosophy is really found in that, oh my gosh, I recognize that that's a cat. How do you recognize that's a cat? That's kind of crazy, right? I mean, your thoughts align with reality, and, you know, the general idea of a cat is found in this particularity. So it's like these kaleidoscope lenses come together, boom, that's a cat. And it's kind of amazing that that occurs. And a lot of great philosophy emerges out of that wonder. And I think Heidegger was doing that too. It's like, look, or the Helen Keller moment, look, it's water. These moments, I want to bring, I really want philosophy based on the moments. These crazy magical moments, if you will, is great philosophy. And actually, when you look back, I mean, I guess Aquinas, maybe the Sumo. I don't want to take a hard position on this, but a lot of great things. But even Aquinas, at the end of his life, is like it's all straw when he has a glimmer. But then also Aquinas does have glimmers into it. I'm thinking as I'm speaking. That's always dangerous. But a lot of great philosophy is more like these apprehensions. As opposed to these great system building. And that also too, I think brings, when you're asking like, why do you write? What's sort of the impulse? And one is to create wonder, but also there's something about wanting wisdom, because also you understand, we're talking about the relation of ideas and praxis. Okay. So the other thing I was going to say is you were talking about how we're always heading towards something not here. There's always a not here that we're heading toward. I think this is pretty easy to, you can actually see it structured in every moment. Like, as I'm speaking, I'm toward the next sentence I'm about to say. I'm toward, drinking this chai latte that I hope doesn't keep me up till midnight. I'm toward this. And yet the funny thing is, if I'm too toward this, what I like to call temporary transcendent dementia, it's transcendent for a moment, and then boom, it's not transcendent. It's transcendent for a moment, and then it's not. If I'm too embedded in that, I won't be listening though. That's the funny thing. Like if I'm too thinking about the next thing I'm going to say, then that's a problem. So I have to have my temporary transcendence also opened up to the other in order to have like to have care. Right? Because then I'm not only caring about what I say and I'm not open to the other. But there is this, you're always kind of toward the future. I think Heidegger understood that. And also too, when you're talking about care, to your point, try to think deeply about something that you think is irrelevant. Like think of something irrelevant. Like take me. Like if I'm thinking about, I was going to say politics, but people might get offended, and politics is supposed to be important. But some of, let's say, the tax code, right? If I'm like, I'm going to think deeply about the tax code. Well, maybe I should care about it. I don't really care about it. I don't want to care about it. The IRS will take my money. That's all I know. But to really think, you have to care about it. Right. It has to matter to you. It has to be in your life. Right. And that's also too why I think we're in big trouble in making the word reason a simile for logic. I think I was talking about that, in one of the YouTube videos that you did, is that reason means both motivation with Viveki. That was lovely. I've really enjoyed him. Really wonderful. It's like reason entails motivation. Like reason also is like to think about what you're motivated to think about, and it gives you a reason to live. So the word reason, what's happened in modernity, it's become a simile for logic. And if it's a simile for logic, if all thinking is just logic, well, I don't necessarily have to care about what I'm logical toward. Oh, and worse yet, we've almost moralized not caring about something you think about, because then your subjectivity is out of the way. Like if you care about something, well, you're too subjective. There's too much of your self-interest invested in it. And we've almost moralized not having self-interest, but you actually don't think well about something you're not self-interested in. So I think we've gotten a lot of trouble in separating thinking and care, where for Heidegger, there's an understanding that true thinking is in service of care, and care also opens up avenues of thinking. Right. So we've really, I guess we talk a lot, we're kind of drunk on the Enlightenment and these weird objectivity, which you apparently are closer to the truth if you're objective, but what's ultimately objective? An object? Objects aren't alive. So there's something true to the idea that you want to be objective in certain circumstances, but if you take that too far and you don't have it in a dialectical relationship with subjectivity, well, then you lose the ground of care that makes possible thinking. And then if there's something you don't care about, you can't even think, because it's hard to think about something you don't care about.
Exactly. And what's even more makes it more interesting, right, is on one level, it's like, I invest care into that. But in another way, I find myself, it's the care that I discover what I care about, right, as my towardness, right? So there's this kind of way where it's not even like an aspect of my own subjective consequence of my subject. It's like my subject shows up already attuned to it in some level, right? So as if it's like almost out in the world, right? Kind of like there is that kind of element of thought where it's like things, like this is what helped me become help me be less messy, is just feel the room, right? And you feel a corner, and then if it's messy, you can feel it because you suffer a little bit. And then if you just go and you literally move stuff around and you step back and you feel it again, you suffer less. So, and you can literally, it will tell you when things are clean, right? And it's like this, it's a way where it's like things are speaking to you, right? This thou-ness of the world in some way in which we're responding to it. So it's like, so a lot of this, I think it comes, this notion, think about this word attunement, right? This kind of fundamental attunement that we already are in some sense, right? I always show up in some way already attuned, concerned, with a first name and a last name, already my attention on something. There's this kind of way in which, in some sense, we find ourselves here already attuned. And then we can, in some sense, there's something incomplete about that attunement, right? That it's kind of like, and I think this is where I think maybe the way that philosophy, if you will, or philosophical thinking is a praxis, right? Because in some sense, it's almost like what we're attuned to, somehow its own limits reach in as unresolved, right? And that there's something about like this way where you're talking about like the language demarcates, it marks the line, right, for which it can't know anything beyond that point, but in that way it's already related to that point, spoken as what's concealed in the word, right? And that you can kind of start to like, I've been thinking about like this kind of philosophical thought is somehow being attuned to that place that we don't have a word for yet you can hear it in between things, you can hear it, you find yourself thinking about it, right? And in some sense, I think that's a little bit about what we're doing right now, is we're like, do you hear that noise? Is that sound, right? Like, what is that sound, right? That we're all responding to. Like, do you hear that? Like, and then we respond to it. And in that response to it, there's this language trail that ends up being something like, modernity. Or something like that, right?
Oh no, I love it. It's like that wonderful poem where it's like, who has seen the wind? Neither I nor you, but when the trees bend down their head, the wind is passing through. So there's something that's moving. You're like, did you see that? Oh, I just saw some trees bending down. Well, no, there must have been something. It's like you heard it. Did you hear that? Well, I love the word attunement. So what's very interesting is we always have to be future oriented. So we always have to be toward a transcendent, a temporary transcendence. Yeah. What's interesting is in order to care about the world, you can't be so future oriented that you're missing the world. You're not caring for it if you're only caring too much about the future potential, if you will. But also if you're only caring about what's there and not also the beautiful possibilities of the thing. Well, I mean, what's there? There's a sticky note, right? What's there? It's blank.
Yeah.
I have to be toward the possibility of the world that's 5 seconds later where I write on it. So it's almost like in care, you have to be towards something that's not yet here, but not too far away. It's just like just temporary. It's like let's say it's a hallway of doors and it's like 6 doors.
Yeah.
When I'm opening this one, I can't be thinking about the 6th one. I have to like really open one and be thinking about the next. And there's an order to things in order for me to engage with them with care, where I'm presently grounded, but also moving toward, because there's a movement. It's like Aristotle kind of talking about where you have formal causes moving to their final courses. There's something in the world that wants to move towards something. So if you don't move with it, you're actually not treating it right in its present state, because its present state is even calling forth to something in the future. So it's not where you're using it. It actually wants to be heading toward to stick with the language I'm going to use, it wants to head toward a harmony. So to use the language of what you're saying about attunement,
yeah,
it's almost like each of us, and I think this ties also to the question of why do you write? A language, it's almost like I'm a string and I want to make sure I'm tuned to the right note.
Yeah.
I'm like a musical instrument where if I'm not tuned to the right note, then we can't make the music. Yeah. And also too, in a good symphony orchestra, if I'm too future oriented, I need to be thinking about the next note, but I don't want to be thinking about the 5th note, right? Yeah. So if I'm like, we're in a symphony orchestra and I'm too future oriented, then I'm going to mess it up and it's not going to come in the right order. Right. But at the same time, if I only play the present note, if I don't move, because the music wants to move, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. It wants to move. There's something in the music that wants to move in a right order to make the piece. If I don't move in it, because I'm like, well, I don't want to, I don't know, use this note, instrumentally use this note. Well, you're going to stay on the note and the music's going to miss, and now the whole thing sounds off. So there's a movement that actually, by following it, you honor the presence of the thing. And that requires attunement. So you're playing the right note to make the music. And there's something, I guess, in a lot of the great philosophy and wisdom, I guess, that's about attunement, so that you're making the right note so that you can be part of the music that is composed in the present being that wants to move into the future in a manner that honors the present, because there's something about the present that does want to move into the future so that it makes music. So you have to have this bothness to the present moment, to the single note that you're playing that's only possible because you're rightly tuned, that makes possible the next note, which makes the next note, all of which you need in the right order to make the music of being.
Huh. This is interesting. And that, I'm just, some things are just coming to mind as we're talking is, so like, so somebody was telling me where they've, you can, and you don't have to do studies about this, but they've done studies about this where like a leader in a group, right? When they move their eyes someplace, everybody moves their eyes over there. Like the leader in the group is the one, like everybody's watching for where the leader's looking. And I was thinking about this, a few things in play here. Like one is like, what's going on there? What is understood, right? What do we understand in like following the look of the leader? Like, and in some sense, I'm kind of getting, well, the leader on some sense is attuned to the horizon of whatever whatever has him to be the most leader, because he's like attuned to some future for which they're in existence for, right? So there's an understanding revealed in that. But then there's this kind of something really interesting to think about is this sense about learning and mimicry. Mimicry is really interesting to think about. Like, what is going on in mimicry? You have 3 kids. I mean, you're living in.
Yeah, I can tell you all about mimicry, mimetic desire that Gerard talks about, because man, that toy in the corner that no one's been interested in, when someone's interested, suddenly all the kids are interested. So I can give you a lot of case studies on Rene Girard if you like to.
Yeah, right, totally. But there's something about, and I've noticed as I've gotten older, right, when I'm around younger men, like it's so weird. It's like I can feel it so precisely. There is a kind of looking up to me in this way where they're relating to me in which they're getting something out of that relation that is different than like my peer or something like that. There's like a certain, it's almost like their nervous systems are just open, right? Like, yeah, I'm thinking about like younger teenagers, right? Where they're kind of, it's like an openness to mentorship, an openness to, right, being led. And it's very visceral, this kind of sense. And it's something about like, I think it has something to do with mimicry, and I think it has something to do with attunement. And this way that, and I think a lot of this is lost. I mean, this is one of the things about the internet and all of this is like kind of this, objectifying and optimization of everything, right? You start to lose this kind of deep education called mentoring, right? Which I think is different than teaching, right? My grandfather was like apprenticed with a tailor for 2 years in Hanover, Germany in the early 20s. And he talks about stories with his tailor that of moments where they're not talking at all about tailoring, right? And in some sense, you get this sense that like, in some way, what mentored him was the way that he just moved his hands when he was talking to his wife, right? There's in some sense the my grandfather you could kind of feel as he's talking and telling these stories, he's telling these stories in which he was kind of in some sense like looking at the horizon that the tailor was always responding to, but could never put into words, that made him what he was sensitive to, already always open to be struck by a particular horizon that led to mastery as being a tailor to moving your hands, right? That there's this way where you can't get that explicitly. You can't tell somebody that. So there's this kind of, this deep kind of intimate indwelling, right? That I think is really, 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 really missing these days, big time.
Oh, absolutely. Well, a few things. One, a way to think about Heidegger in my mind is that he wants us to be mentored by being, in the language of mentor as you're talking about it. Also, Aristotle is like, a lot of the great philosophers want us to be mentored by being itself. Yeah. It's like, Aristotle's like, look, everything changes. Yeah. So it's really important for Aristotle, like metaphysics follows physics. Like everything in Aristotle leads to one another. I call it Aristotle's chain. So it's like, well, if all we ever experience is change, then how is that bookcase over there always a bookcase? Well, there must be substance, form, and essence to make it such that it maintains some sort of stable suchness in that change. So they're always like being mentored by being. Yeah. And that's something you miss. That's what the great philosophers want us to do, as opposed to making some sort of system to capture being. Yeah. I think it can feel like they're trying to capture being because they're trying to understand that they're trying to figure out how to be mentored by being. They're trying to figure out how to be in harmony with this thing. Under it.
Yeah.
Yes. And so that entails understanding, but it would be a mistake to say it's an understanding that wants to capture it. Like, does the apprentice want to capture the mentor? Like put them in a bottle or something? I mean, no, but they want to, in a sense, understand, which entails a capturing, but it's almost like an open hand. My wife has this great metaphor where she talks about the difference between the man who owns a bird because it holds it by the legs and the man who owns a bird because the bird sits on the hand. And, between those two, who really owns the bird?
Yeah.
The one that the bird stays on the hand, because the bird wants to be there, as opposed to the one clutching the legs. That man doesn't really own his bird. It's more of the one with the open hand, because the bird wants to stay there. And maybe it flies off, but 2 days later it comes back. That's the one who really owns the bird. And that's, to me, what the great philosophers are trying to do with being. They don't want to clutch the bird. They want to have an open hand to being, and then it comes back. And that's what they're trying to do. But it looks like both people look like they're owning the bird, because in a sense, they have some sort of relation with the bird, but the orientation in that ownership is radically, radically different. And the one with the open hand is actually more in harmony with the bird, than the one clutching. Yeah. So here's the thing. You're talking about the young men. One of the things too, is it's like we all have mirror neurons, right? Where we naturally kind of mirror the people around us. There's a sense in which the metaphysics is like, metaphysics almost wants to say all of being has mirror neurons, like all of reality has mirror neurons in it, but things are like struggling to figure out how to mirror one another. It's almost like Leibniz monad, but it wants to find some sort of harmony. And there's also something about this harmony we're describing, which is how you get belonging. Because you were talking about young men, there's this crisis now where nobody feels like they belong. Well, that's also going to be part of feeling like you're not attuned to the world, right? That you're out of harmony with the world. Because take the symphony orchestra. You have everyone playing their notes, but there's a violin over here playing an F sharp. There's no F sharp in like the key of C or something. The whole song is in C major, and this guy over here is playing an F minor. He doesn't belong. He's out of harmony, and in being out of harmony, he also doesn't belong, right? So if you have a crisis where nobody feels like they're at home, and I think this is very pressing for young men, as you mentioned. You see this with young men especially. So they don't feel like they belong because they don't feel like they're harmonizing with the world. Yeah. And so they're looking for an attunement so that they can get back to they're out of tune. They want to get back to where they can play a whole note that's in the C major so that they're attuned, and then they can feel like belonging again. And I guess, again, a reason I write, you're asking, why do you write? What drives me to write and to think about philosophy is because you want to have that harmony in being that makes possible belonging, that to do you need attunement, because you don't have the attunement, you're going to be clutching the feet of the bird as opposed to having your hand open and letting the bird dwell there.
Right. So interesting. So basically what you're saying is when you're writing, another way you're in some sense, as you're writing, you're in some sense, you're feeling the outlines of being, let's say, and you're mimicking it in your writing in some sense. You're doing this deep attunement. Because it's interesting, like, how do we know we're like, oh, okay, I said it. Right? How do you know? Well, it tells you. Right? It tells you. It really does. Like it's like when you really say what you think, like when you don't say it. It's also you don't know, like language will tell you when you don't have the right word. It'll be the thing that tells you. There is this sense where you're always in this deep relationship with this. And I appreciate what you're saying. That's really, 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 really an awesome way of putting that. Because that's one of the things I think it's one of the motives I have in why make videos and put them out, right? Is because I think that there is something I want to share. And I think it's is that this, like when we say philosophy and we talk about these things, I think that the image people have is, like you're talking about, is this way of grabbing the bird or these philosophical system or this kind of abstract thing. But it's the most intimate, grounded, being tutored by being, right? In this deep, deep, deep way, right? That's what had me think about, like, what is it like for you, right? Like, so you
asked me a question about my biographical life, and I don't know. I'm just some crazy farm person. How did I get into philosophy? How did I get into philosophy? I took a lot of walks.
When did you remember you started reading it?
When did I start reading it? Well, you see, I think most of my childhood was spent writing a science fiction series called Sword of Tribulation from 5th grade on to college, and then taking a lot of walks in the mountain, and I worked as a photographer. So that also reminds me. Yeah. So I think that got me thinking about things, because so there was a few things. And when did I start reading it? Well, I heard of books in middle school, and then things started to develop. When did I start reading? Oh, I guess I was, maybe I was sitting in the garden, and there was Being in Time in front of me, and I heard the children say, pick it up in the other garden, and then I picked it up under a pear tree or something. Great. So anyway, but there's good. I was wondering, I got my Augustine glass bead. Anyway, there is something though, again, another way I think to put the philosopher, and I think like Heidegger was big on walks and the different things like that, is another way to look at philosophy is what it's trying to do is it's trying to figure out, okay, we know we can't create rainbows, But let's pay attention to the world to figure out what are the conditions that make rainbows appear, and then let's put ourselves in those conditions. And you notice as a philosopher, you go, oh, wait, it's when it rains. Rain's important. Okay. Attunement to being, that's important. Okay. And then the sun breaks through. Oh, wonder, that's important. And then you go outside. You can't stay inside the house. You have to go outside. And that's when you see a rainbow. Yeah. So the good philosophers are not like trying to create a rainbow. Yeah. They're trying to pay attention to being, to figure out the conditions that make certain things occur. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. But for some, maybe, I think this is where Heidegger is good, where he's talking about like technological thinking, capturing everything. Yeah. It's like, we're so I'm sorry. We're so technocratic in our thinking that our metaphors now are like philosophy is building something. Like, because we're projecting onto it our technocrat society, as opposed to, like I do a lot in economics, and I always, Friedrich Hayek in his Nobel Prize speech, he made the argument, whether it's true or not is a different question, where he said economics is not an engine that you tune, it's a garden that you cultivate. And the point he was making is that if you think of an economic system as an engine, your economic policy will be radically different than if you think it's a garden that grows, that you got to make sure that it has enough water and stuff, but ultimately you can't force a seed to grow. You can't take a wrench and hit a seed and make it turn into a flower. Yeah. Likewise, it's almost like we now read back upon philosophy this idea that all these cats were mechanics and they were building an engine, when really they're more like cultivating a garden, or they're going outside because they're trying to figure out how you see a rainbow. Yeah. And that's paying attention. And you were also talking about I guess I also got into philosophy because of fiction writing. I did a lot of novels, stories, and different things, and we write under O.G. Rose, and that hopefully won't just rot and collect mildew over here in the corner. Maybe they'll see the light of day. Who knows? But there's this funny thing that happens when you're writing. When you write, you think it's really good, and then you reread it, and you say, "Wow, that sucks. What was I thinking?" And then you edit it, and then you edit it, and then you edit it for 5 years, and then one day you look at it and go, "Bam! That's it." And you just know, you see it, you have this sense, you're like, bam, that's it. It works. And the whole book works. You have this sense of the whole coming together, editing, boom, it comes together. And there's this magical moment of apprehension. The Aristotelian, boom, that's a cat. Boom, that's a rainbow. And I think also for me, I always think about Heidegger's philosophy too, as something like that, where he's in Being and Time and he's like, there's something here. So you take let's take that 6th grade, the Sword of Tribulation. So you write that and you're like, oh, I think this plot is really good. It's really good. And then you go back in 7th grade and you're like, wow, this sucks. But you don't throw out the whole thing. You edit it. It's like, well, no, keep this, maybe refine it. You're working. And then by the time it becomes like, now I have the plot line. You do that and turn the world to black. Likewise, it always seems to Heidegger and a lot of the great philosophers, actually. Like, I think one of the things that's really screwed us up is a lot of times we'll think about early Wittgenstein, later Wittgenstein, early Heidegger, later Heidegger. I think that's a problem. And the reason I think it's a problem, it would be like taking like early Sword of Tribulation, later Sword of Tribulation. Early, it's like, no, it's an editorial process that you're moving toward an apprehension as you go. And it's almost like we accuse them of changing their mind. You hear that? It's like this changing, and sometimes there's changing of mind. But if I take a sentence that I wrote in the 6th grade and I edit it now, am I changing my mind? Well, the subject of the sentence doesn't change, but I've learned how to make it better, how to say it better, how to cut different things. I think sometimes we need to think about what a lot of these philosophers are doing as something similar to the fiction writer going back and revising. They're not, maybe they throw out an entire chapter. Dude, there are like, I mean, when you get a novel finished, there's probably like 10,000 words you end up cutting. Does that mean you should have never written those words? Dude, if you had to write them, you had to do the process of having a lot of fat, because when you're in the process of thinking an entire novel, you just don't have time. If you edit while you're writing, you'll never finish the book. Like if you have too hard, well, let me just say for me, when I have too, there might be other writers who are different. If I'm too editorial, when I'm doing that initial birth of the project, it just dies. I can't finish it. You have to go, which means the fat, if you will, is required, that then must be trimmed off later, that if you didn't have, you could never get the finished product that you apprehend is correct. And I sometimes wonder, and I guess I'd have to think about it more, if sometimes we make a big mistake in not realizing that philosophers, in a state of wonder with the world, whose project is the world itself, are always in an editorial process as they go. Because otherwise we just say, oh, early Heidegger, later Heidegger, oh, he changed his mind, oh, he was wrong. No, he's getting closer, finding it, taking it, working, chiseling. It's got a block of marble and you're chiseling the statue out of it. I just think sometimes that early, later is wrong. I don't mean to say there aren't differences in early and later Wittgenstein, and clearly the Wittgenstein of uncertainty is different from et cetera. But I think there's a mistake there. I think there's a mistake.
Yeah. But I know Heidegger talks about like, Gadmer, the hermeneutic circle, this kind of quality of that, this understanding of that, that the current understanding that you're stepping on like moves back and circles back around. And when it circles back around, it's not the same understanding as when it circled around before. And that deepening process is not just in how we read text, but it's the way that time unfolds for us. Like,
and before the main thing I want to say, I'm interrupting. I'm a terrible person. Us Virginia people are so rude. Before I forget, one of the big mistakes is you have to understand that circling you're describing means you had to go through the earlier stages and go and go and go. But if you do this thing where you say later, early Wittgenstein and later Wittgenstein, you make it sound like they had a whole system that they finished, and then they did another system later on, and that they knew what they were doing. And so then that feeds this thinking of philosophers as system builders, as opposed to these people trying to apprehend and circling where you have to go through all the different stages to get there. So that stupid, no, I shouldn't say stupid. I tell my children not to say stupid. So sometimes when I do these Zoom calls and I say stupid out loud, he'll behave and say, don't say stupid from downstairs. But it's 11 o'clock, so they're asleep right now. But that thinking of early and late feeds the systemizing thinking, when really the great philosopher is wondering and wandering as they're going through it.
Yeah, it's wondering and wandering, and I'm it's having me just kind of settle into this sense of this connection between understanding and listening, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, in circling, I've come to understand that most of what circling is really a very, very, very deep practice in listening, right? And attunement. But what's interesting about that is that, like, if you look at, most people think of it like without thinking about it. They think listening is that thing that just happens if you don't talk while the other person's talking, right? Or that you're just this open head and that you just pour the words in, and if if you're empty enough, all the words will get in or something. But what's interesting is that if I think while I'm listening to you, I immediately stop listening. Yes. Right. So there's this deep coupling to whatever it is that thinks and then whatever it is that listens are very, very, they're deeply, deeply coupled. So in some sense, to deeply listen is to, in some way, is to give my mind to you and allow your speech to think my thought for me in some sense, right? Yeah. And in that sense, I think that certain, and so then, and also it's also in terms of my speaking, right? Speech only makes sense if it speaks into a listening, right? Like you can have a listening, you can imagine having a listening there without speaking, but it's almost impossible to imagine people talking if there's no listening in which it's responding to. So it's kind of like,
you just don't have the right imaginary friends. Okay, my imaginary friends are really good, and they talk all the time. So I'll have mine come over to your place. All right, they'll help you out a little bit.
I trust that. So there is this kind of receptive quality, right? That it's funny. It's like it's receptive, but it's profoundly active. And I think that it's so funny watching people for years and years and years become better and better listeners is simultaneous with them becoming more articulate, right?
Yes.
Being more intelligent, being more attuned, being more precise, being more insightful, right? As they just focus on listening, their ability to perceive, right, and pay attention and to say with less words, right? Just the right to, just watching this for years, And in some sense, you usually don't think about that, like that people would usually describe that as thinking, but to really listen, right? And there are some thoughts that to really think, they must stand on presuppositions that are different than my own. And when you start to listen at that level, some thoughts that you can hear, the hearing of which has you let go of presuppositions and stand on new ones, and then you end up being a different person, right, as a function of listening, right, in some sense. And I think about, like, I often have this feeling about, like, this kind of sense that we're talking about the philosopher as like a craftsman, right, is like a is it out in the back in the shed, right? There's this kind of way in which, in some sense, they are listening to being, right? Like they're listening to the wood, and they're listening to the trees, they're listening to that thing that just happened with my wife, and they're listening to how it all comes together, right? And in some sense, their speech is kind of a testimony to what they're hearing in some sense.
Absolutely. You see, we have so a few things. One on there, a few things. One, another mistake we made today is we assume somebody's not listening if they don't agree with us, and that's where politics have pointed and everything. So you must not have been listening if you don't think like me. So another reason that listening is dead is that we assume the people aren't listening around us if they have their own thoughts. So that's been a big problem. That's a different subject. Second, if you take listening seriously, then you are saying that there is something outside of me that is real and that I am lacking, that I need to be full, to actually be fully engaged or to fully even be. There is very interesting in the West, and Daniel was talking about this, and I mentioned in just Elon Musk and the simulation theory. Like in the West, we really ask, how do you know anything is real? The very asking of that question says something about your society. The very fact that you would even wonder, is the world out there real? One is going to lead you to nihilism. It's a suggestion of nihilism, as you see in the Kyoto School. But it also kind of suggests that you have a society that's not really listening, or that ultimately thinks what it hears is produced by yourself. And so there's a very egocentric notion that is embedded in that question that also says we're not very good at listening. Also, if you have a society that's not good at listening, it's probably not good at reading either, because reading is also an act of taking in. Like, how do most people read books now? I think, a lot of, unfortunately, critical reading. Isn't that funny? Like, you don't read a book unless you're critical of it, criticize, as if you are the judge to stand over it. And this is the deconstruction Derrida unleashed. To Derrida's defense, he did not intend that. I think it's probably similar to Plato. I think the Platonists are very different from Plato. I think deconstructionists are different from Derrida. That's a different subject. I had a good friend once who said, it's okay to be Plato. It's not okay to be a Platonist. It's okay to be Aristotle, not an Aristotelian, a quiet, and so forth and so on. And he was trying to make the point that very often the followers of a thinker get it wrong. And that gets into Harold Bloom map of misreading and anything. Anyway, our now entire thinking about reading is to be a critical reader, a critical thinker, a critical listener. Everything is critical. And, when we use the word critical, we tend to mean deeply engaged, but words matter. And it doesn't take long before critical becomes critical. Like you're not, but of course, if you go into Plato, I keep using Plato as an example. If you go into Plato and you believe that you only really engage with Plato if you're critical of Plato, well, that's not hard. You can always find something in a text to be critical of, which might just because you don't understand it. But guess what's beautiful? If you think you're being a critical reader and you don't understand something, it's the author's fault. They did a bad job. It's not your fault. It's their fault. You are the critic. Here's the other thing. So critical reading makes you critical, and then you're the critic. And what is the critic? The critic's the one who has the power. I decide if this is good or bad. I decide if this is useful or not. And if you really want to, there is not a single book, a single idea, a single person of whom you cannot disqualify from your world. You will always find a reason to disqualify them. You will always find an idea that's poorly formulated. You will always find some sort of flaw in your partner that will justify endless criticism. So we think you are smart if you are critical. Well, then why the heck would you listen? The only reason you would listen to someone is to figure out what they're saying wrong. The only reason you would critically think is to figure out what's wrong with the world. A critical thinker is therefore someone who's finding what's wrong with the world. That's the exact opposite of what Heidegger is talking about. Heidegger is like, no, you're wrong and you need to get attuned with the world. You are the string that's out of tune. You need to get in tune with the music of being. You're a string that is off the note. Here's the music of being. You need to get in tune. But we have been led to believe it's the exact opposite. We're the music and the world is the string that's off and the world needs to get tuned. We're the music and Plato is hard to read. So he needs to get his act together because we associate being intelligent with being critical, which then is to make us a critic. We have all the power. There's nothing that the world can teach us. And then we're wondering. And then, of course, it doesn't take long from there to get to the place where we're saying, well, does any of it matter anyway? Is any of it real anyway? Is there anything that's worth putting reason in? Well, no, because you've disqualified it all, because you are the judge. And here's the great Kafka joke. If you're actually the one that's broken, but in your mind, you have created yourself as the standard by which to determine what is right attunement, then you must by definition attune the world to your brokenness, to your offness. And so increasingly the world becomes off to you. Increasingly it becomes out of tune to you. So again, I was saying earlier that philosophy has real stakes. And like I do the writing and things to figure out what paradigm is the correct way to go to the world. If you get this wrong, if you think that the world is broken and you are the music that the world needs to get attuned with, but actually you're the thing out of tune, then in the name of harmonizing the world, you will make it more out of tune. There are real stakes to making sure you understand which thing needs to do the adjustment. But if instead you go in and say, no, I need to do the adjustment. I need to adjust myself to Plato. I need to tune myself to Plato. I need to tune myself to the world. Then you live very, very differently. And I think this is all to say that the category of critical thinking has contributed, because metaphors matter, has contributed to us thinking that the world is the note that is off, the thing that needs to be attuned, and it needs to be tuned to the music of us. But since we're actually the disharmony, then the world becomes disharmonious, and then nihilism takes over. And then are we shocked? Are we shocked that nihilism is taking over the world? We are literally tuning it out of tune, thinking that we're tuning it to the music of us.
Yeah. Awesome. This is probably a good place. This is probably a good place.
Is it? It's only 11, dude. I mean, I've got another hour or something, Stephen. I did want to mention before I forget too, I really enjoyed your piece on gratitude. I think a lot about how things like gratitude and listening. Another thing I was going to bring up, because no, I'm not stopping. I've got plenty of coffee. Is there's also something about listening. There's also something about, there's something in game theory called Nash Equilibriums, which are the idea that if all actors involved in a problem are rational, you get a suboptimal result.
Yeah.
Well, likewise, one of the problems with instrumental rationality is we end up getting suboptimal results, because rationality without the information of the other, without the being of the other that we only get for listening, then what actually is rational for us is very contained to our own framework of reference, and we get suboptimal results. It's also why stuff like gratitude, like the reason I like your piece on gratitude, because it also reminds me of forgiveness. Like literally gratitude can save you from Nash equilibriums, because when people aren't grateful, they probably have suffered something painful that they therefore have good reason not to be grateful. But then if they're not grateful, they're going to orientate themselves to a world that's going to make things worse. So the only way to break that Nash equilibrium-esque situation is to be grateful for a world that you have reason not to be grateful for, so that you organize your decision-making in a manner that saves you from the suboptimal result that you would get to with rational activity relative to the past that you suffered. And I think that also happens with forgiveness. I actually think sometimes that some of the religious traditions actually unintentionally had solutions to game theory problems like Nash equilibrium without even realizing it. Because like forgiveness, you have very rational reason not to forgive someone. Your wife yelled at you. Your husband doesn't take care of the kids. You have good reason to be mad. But literally, if you do what's rational from thinking your husband is a bad dad, they'll become a worse dad. And so you have to have forgiveness to overcome that game theory problem. So I like game theory. And I want to write, I wrote a note this morning because I'd read your piece on the role of things like gratitude, forgiveness and other things as overcoming game theory problems. But you probably have work to get that. You wanted to draw to a close because you got like a meeting at 7 o'clock. I don't even know what time it is over there at 8 o'clock. I really like circling, by the way. I think it's a wonderful thing. Like I say, well, because again, if it is the case, there were 2 more things I was going to say, which means there's 4 more things to say because they breed like bunnies. And, one of the things I was going to say is that the stuff you're doing at circling, in fact, would be breaking through some of these I call them rational impasses with my friend Lorenzo, these game theory problems like Nash Equilibrium. You're actually training people where they're listening to get out of their singular rationality that necessarily leads to suboptimal results by opening them up to a collective intelligence or different activities of other people that aren't just enlightenment, autonomous rationality, so they can get better results that I wanted to say. So I think that's all really, really important. And the second thing I was going to say is you mentioned wisdom. The big thing also too why I think wisdom is in fact an apprenticeship model is that wisdom is handed down as opposed to handed off. And what I mean by that is technology is handed off. Like I'm just born in a world where there are light bulbs. I'm born and lo and behold, there are light bulbs. I don't have to do anything. They're just there. The technology is there. And generally their knowledge is also handed off like a baton. I have the idea of a baton, right? You're in a race and like the past generation hands you a baton and you keep going. But wisdom is like someone hands you a book, but you have to read it. There's no guarantee that just because there were wise people in the past, that you will be wise now, even though there basically is a guarantee that because cars were invented in the past, you will have cars now. So cars are handed off, you get the baton, but wisdom is handed down. But here's the problem. Since knowledge and technology is handed off, we tend to think that also wisdom is handed off. We don't realize that wisdom is something that we have to redo every generation for ourselves. Another way to look at it is just because your grandmother was healthy doesn't mean you're healthy. Health is something that you have to do, even though you may have bicycles, exercise technologies, you may have health technologies that past generations did. Those are handed off. Health itself cannot be handed off. You have to do it. So wisdom is like that, but we tend to think that wisdom is just knowledge. And because there were wise people in the past, that we therefore get that wisdom handed off to us when it's only handed down to us. And I think today, maybe because of this gets into Freud and some of the Cadilla, maybe because in modernity, there are such major existential and psychological pressures that there are a lot of people who are feeling the need for wisdom to get the map to survive the territory. And they're looking around and they're like, everybody thinks that it's handed off, but it wasn't. We got cars, but we didn't necessarily get wisdom. Well, maybe it's different from knowledge. Maybe there's some additional activity and then people are looking for Circling Institute. They are looking for YouTube and different things because wisdom is only handed down. It isn't handed off. So I think that's like really critical. And I think that too, that's also one of the reasons why is Heidegger writing, right? Because it's almost like Aristotle can hand down his books, but then you have to understand it yourself. And so every philosopher is trying to regain wisdom. And as they do it, they also approach it from different angles. Maybe for Aristotle, it was the word water, like Helen Keller, that activated the world. But for Heidegger, it's the world being, and that's what activated the world. Maybe for me, it's the word cat, and that activates the world. So it's different. And so I think that's also why, people often say the great conversation never ends. And sometimes you hear that and it's kind of cliche and you're like, oh, that's nice. That's just an excuse you philosopher people can make for not being practical. You just say it never ends so you can get away with not being practical. Well, it really helps when you say health never ends either. Health never ends. Relationships never end. Any of the stuff. Guess what? Pretty much all the stuff in your life that matters most is handed down to you, not handed off to you. And so likewise, relationships never end. Health never ends. Philosophy never ends. It's just like all the other stuff. It's kind of weird. We think like philosophy and I guess the humanities in general, we kind of act as if because it never ends, it doesn't matter. Like, it's like, oh, the conversation never ends, so they never get anywhere. But that would be like saying you have to exercise and eat well all the time. Oh, and therefore it doesn't matter. That's almost like it would be like saying, it's like, because you have to eat healthy every day in order to have good health, therefore it doesn't matter. That's ridiculous. Well, likewise to say, well, just because you have to do philosophy all the time, therefore, or the conversation never ends, it doesn't matter. And I guess it also really helps to get that once you understand that philosophy is primarily in the business of apprehension as opposed to system building. Yeah. You are trying to train a muscle to apprehend being, so you can attune yourself to the music. That is like a muscle that you train. You get more and more ability to get to the ability where you can even apprehend wonder in hardship, in suffering, from not just a rainbow, but from when the deer eat all your tomatoes, for example. You're trying to attune yourself to deeper and deeper abilities to apprehend something more. So it's a muscle that you train, and therefore too, if philosophy is primarily in this business per se of apprehension, then it's practical. It's incredibly practical because apprehension is something you practically do, and it impacts how you practically live in the world. So wisdom is practical, but if you think philosophy is system building, then it's very easy to think it's not practical. Because it's just a system. And then it's, what are the chances of it being right? I mean, it's just, Nassim Taleb, Black Swan, all the epistemologists, like, what are the chances of your system being right? Very low. But that's why the great philosophers are not in their business. They're in the business of apprehending. What is the probability that your apprehension is high, is true, or has some connection with truth? Much higher. Much higher. And so suddenly, once you understand that philosophy is primarily about training a muscle of apprehension, it becomes practical, it becomes more reliable, it increases wonder, it helps you with relationships, and it becomes a lens by which you see the world without which you will not know how to practice in it. And it will be a practice that will cultivate the ability to hold the bird with your hand open, the bird of wonder, as opposed to clutching its legs, so that you also tune yourself to the music of the world, as opposed to think that you are the music.
Yeah. Damn. You almost made up for the but not having the bunny suit.
Almost for the bunny suit. No, nothing makes up for not having the bunny suit. No, Guy, you don't have to mess. I know, nothing makes up for it. I'm sorry. I'll go wake my daughter up and just send you a private photo of the pink bunny suit from the Christmas story. I'm really upset too about not having the golden bridge. Like I told you, for lightning bread, the giant puffed up. I mean, I just thought if I paid off one credit card with another credit card with another credit card, I'd be fine. I mean, that's what Jerome Powell taught me, but I don't know. So I'm really sorry about that. Right. But music and stuff, that's pretty good. But Guy, this has been delightful. I really appreciate your time.
Let's do this. This will be the first of many, I can tell.
Well, I tell you what, if you hear a knock on the door, it's going to be my daughter Grace apologizing, and then I'll be there in the bunny suit next door. Okay, so I'll just knock on the door. I've got 3 hours to get there before sunset or something, so that'll work out. And my wife makes a tremendous squash casserole. I don't make anything worth a darn, except, I love it how men think they cook because they heat stuff up on a grill. Isn't that great? Yeah. Hey, I heat salmon on a grill. I'm a great cook, Okay, that's nice. With some tin foil too and a little garlic salt. Oh yeah, good stuff. But we have a really good squash casserole. And I'll even show you the wood porch that you can get close to and feel the abstraction of the lines to, like we were saying at the beginning. So you'll be able to use the porch in that way. But Guy, I appreciate your time, sir. This has been really, really delightful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, my friend. Good night.
Have a good one, sir. Loved you. You have a good one, sir. All the best.